a 15th century diplomat, a genius strategist, the man who literally wrote the book on power. And yet Niccolò Machiavelli spent the final years of his life completely music, destroyed by women he paid for company. Not one, not 10, 400. And what he observed in those encounters about men, about desire, about weakness became the most suppressed lesson in all of his writings. This is what almost no one talks about. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is about the real psychology behind power, human behavior, and the hidden music, forces that shape why people do what they do. Today, we're going into territory most psychology channels won't touch, because it involves a man most people only half understand, and a truth about male psychology that is deeply uncomfortable. We're talking about Machiavelli, not the strategist, not the philosopher, the man. Because inside the life of this brilliant, ruthless thinker was a fatal contradiction. And if you can understand why that contradiction existed, you will understand something about male psychology that most men go their entire lives without ever confronting. Stay with me, this is going to change how you see yourself. Segment 1, who was Machiavelli, really? Most people think they know Machiavellian. They've heard the word Machiavellian. They know he wrote The Prince. They know he was cold, calculating, ruthless. But here's what the textbooks don't tell you. Niccolò Machiavelli was for most of his adult life genuinely powerful. He served as a senior diplomat for the Florentine Republic. He traveled across Europe negotiating with kings and popes. He studied Caesar, Hannibal, Burra, the most dangerous men in history, and extracted the patterns of how they won and how they fell. He was obsessed with one question. Why do powerful men destroy themselves? He watched it happen over and over. Men who held entire armies in music, their hands. Men who commanded nations. Men who had everything losing it, all because of one predictable repeating weakness. He wrote about it in The Prince. He wrote about it in his discourses. He even wrote about it in his private letters. And the answer he kept coming back to was not betrayal by enemies. It was not lack of strategy. It was not bad luck. It was desire. Specifically, a man's inability to master his own hunger for women. And here's the dark irony. The man who identified this weakness more clearly than almost music, anyone in human history could not escape it himself. Segment 2, the fall Machiavelli's secret life. In 1512, the Medici family returned to power in Florence. Machiavelli was stripped of his government position, arrested, tortured, and then released into exile on his own farm outside the city. Everything he had built gone. He was 43 years old. He had a wife, children, debts, and he had nothing left to do but think. During this period, he wrote music, his most famous works. But he also wrote something else, his private letters to his friend Francesco Vittori. And in those letters, the mask comes off completely. He writes about visiting the local inns and brothel. He describes in startling honesty how he would spend his evenings with women of low music status. Women he refers to with sometimes brutal frankness, and then he would go home to his desk, put on what he called his royal and courtly garments metaphorically, and write about the nature of power. It's almost unbearable to read. This giant of strategic thought writing about being mocked by a woman he desired, laughed at, manipulated, made to feel pathetic. Oh my God. And the most remarkable thing about these letters, he knew it was happening. He wasn't deluded. He watched himself fall into weakness the same way a scientist watches a chemical reaction. He could describe it, analyze it, and he still could not stop it. In one of his most famous letters, he writes about a woman he encountered at an inn. He describes her charms and then, almost laughing at himself, he confesses that even knowing she was manipulating him, even seeing the trap clearly, he walked right into it. Why? Because knowing about a weakness and being free from it are two completely different things. And this right here is the psychology lesson that most men never learn. Segment 3, the psychology, what Machiavelli saw in men. So let's go deeper. Because what Machiavelli observed about male weakness wasn't just personal confession. It was a pattern. In his writings identified what we might today call the desire blind spot, the psychological phenomenon where a man's reasoning, judgment, and self-awareness go offline the moment desire is activated. He writes in The Prince that men more easily forget the death of their father than the loss of their possessions. But what he observed music, personally, was even darker. Men more easily forget their own dignity than they forget the object of their desire. Think about that. He watched powerful rulers negotiate brilliant peace treaties in the morning, then humiliate themselves music, chasing a woman who didn't want them by nightfall. He watched men of extraordinary discipline, soldiers, merchants, statesmen become completely irrational the moment sexual desire was involved. And in the language of modern psychology, we now understand why this happens. When a man is in a state of desire, specifically sexual desire, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term thinking, risk assessment, and social judgment, gets suppressed. The limbic system, the ancient emotional survival-driven part, takes over. This is not weakness. This is biology, but Machiavelli's insight was this: biology is not destiny. The men who understood this process, who could see it happening in themselves, had a chance of managing it. The men who were unconscious of it were permanently at the mercy of anyone who understood it better than they did and who understood it best. The women who worked in the inns and brothel of Florence. This is not a moral judgment. This is an observation about information asymmetry. These women had studied male psychology out of pure survival necessity. They knew with surgical precision how to trigger desire, how to sustain it, how to use it. Not because they were evil, but because understanding men was their livelihood. They were, in a very real sense, some of the most skilled practical psychologists of the Renaissance, and Machiavelli, watching them work, was watching the most honest experiment in human behavioral science available to him. Segment 4, the three weaknesses, what he identified. So what exactly did Machiavelli see? Let's break down the three core male weaknesses his writings, both published and private music, describe. Weakness number 1, the need for validation from women. Machiavelli observed that powerful men who commanded armies and intimidated rivals, would become psychologically soft the moment they sought approval from a woman they desired. The need for her to see him as powerful became more important than actually being powerful. He described men who would lie about their wealth, exaggerate their status, make promises they couldn't keep, not for strategic advantage, but simply to see admiration in a woman's eyes. In modern psychology, this is tied to external locus of control. The tendency to place one's sense of worth outside oneself in the validation of music, others. When a man does this with a woman he desires, he hands her enormous power over his internal state. She doesn't even have to try. The moment he needs her approval to feel good about himself, she holds leverage over him, often without realizing it. Weakness number 2, desire clouds judgment toward risk. The second weakness Machiavelli observed was this: men in a state of desire dramatically underestimate risk. In his diplomatic career, he saw men make dangerous political alliances, compromise entire nations, because the alliance came through a woman they were infatuated with. He saw men trust people they shouldn't trust, ignore warnings they should have heeded, take actions they would never have taken with a clear mind simply because desire was clouding their threatment. The Romans had a phrase for this: amore est mentis perturbio, love is a disturbance of the mind. Machiavelli agreed, but he went further. He said that the disturbance was predictable and that a truly dangerous opponent would always look for the woman in a powerful man's life as the music vector of attack. Not to seduce him, to study him, because a man in desire reveals everything: his insecurities, his needs, his soft spots. Weakness number 3, confusing surrender with intimacy. This is the most subtle and perhaps the most important. Machiavelli observed that men often wanted to be overcome by desire. On some level, they sought the relief of surrender and control because being powerful, being strategic, calculating, always in command is exhausting. Desire offered an escape, a permission slip to stop thinking and just feel. And so music, men weren't just falling into weakness, they were running toward it. This is what modern psychology calls the intimacy control paradox. The same drive that makes a man seek mastery over his environment makes him secretly yearn for someone or something that can overpower him, at least temporarily. And the women in those Florentine establishments, they understood this intuitively. They weren't just offering physical pleasure. They were offering release from the burden of self-control. That's a far more powerful product. Segment 5, the lesson. What this means for you. Now, here's where we get to the part that actually matters. Because none of this history means anything if it doesn't connect to something real in your life. Machiavelli died in 1527, still writing, still thinking, still failing to fully master the weakness he understood better than almost anyone. His tragedy was not that he lacked knowledge. His tragedy was the gap between knowledge and embodied change. And that gap is the same one that exists in most men today. You can know that you're seeking external validation. That doesn't mean you've stopped seeking it. You can know that desire clouds your judgment. That doesn't mean your judgment won't get clouded. Knowledge is the map, but the map is not the territory. So what do you actually do with this? Step 1, observe, don't suppress. Machiavelli's most powerful tool, the one he used even when it didn't save him, was observation. He watched himself with detached curiosity. He documented his own weakness rather than pretending it didn't exist. Most men deal with their vulnerabilities by burying them, by performing strength, by never admitting even to themselves that they are deeply biologically susceptible to desire. That performance doesn't make the vulnerability go away. It just makes it invisible. And invisible vulnerabilities are the most dangerous kind because they can be exploited by anyone paying attention. Step 2, understand what you're actually seeking. When a man chases desire compulsively, he is almost never chasing the thing in front of him. He's chasing something beneath it. Machiavelli's obsession with women in his exile years wasn't really about the women. It was about significance. He had lost his place in the world. He had been humiliated by history. And in those dark rooms for a few hours, he could feel, if not powerful, at least wanted. Ask yourself, what is the desire pointing toward? What emotional need is it trying to fill? Because when you can answer that question honestly, the external object loses some of its power over you. You can address the actual need, the hunger beneath the hunger. Step 3, build your identity from the inside. The reason powerful men are more vulnerable to this particular weakness, not less, is because they've built their identity on external performance. When the performance is stripped away by exile, by failure, by age, there is nothing underneath. And so they reach outward desperately for something to tell them they still exist. The man who has built his identity from within, from values, from craft, from a clear relationship with his own mind, does not become less when the external trappings fall away. He remains himself. That is the armor Machiavelli never fully built, and it is the thing he was in his own oblique way, pointing toward in all of his greatest writing. Machiavelli spent his final years on that small farm in exile, writing some of the most brilliant political psychology ever produced and struggling every night with the weakness he'd diagnosed in every powerful man he'd ever studied. His life is not a cautionary tale about failure. It's a cautionary tale about the gap between seeing clearly and living accordingly. The lesson isn't that desire is bad. The lesson is that unconscious desire is a leash and someone somewhere is always willing to hold the other end. The question Machiavelli was asking, the question he never fully answered, is the same question worth asking yourself tonight. Who is actually in control of your choices? If this video made you think, do one thing, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more content on the psychology of power, self-mastery, and human behavior, subscribe. We go deep here. See you in the next one.